Thank you for sounding reasonably cheerful. Okay, so as usual, I want to start by showing you what's online to help you out with this. And I actually did manage to dig up some pretty good stuff for Aphra Behn. So some of this would really be worth spending a little bit of time with, particularly the link to the International Slavery Museum. So the first thing I want to show you, there is an interactive journal for women in the arts in the long 18th century. So usually scholars, when we talk about literary historical periods, we talk about the long something or other century, right? So whenever the tendencies that dominated, say, the 18th century start to come into practice, even if it's an earlier period, we include that. Whenever those practices cease, that's when we sort of end the period. So by the long 18th century, we're actually talking about a period from roughly 1640 to 1830. So this interactive journal is hosted by the Aphra Behn Society. It's published by the Aphra Behn Society. You can find articles on Aphra Behn and other women writers from this period. It's all free. It's easily searchable. So you can get all kinds of things from there. Also, just a brief little link to a BBC History biography of Behn. It's really, really short. Can anybody guess why this biography is so bloody short compared to perhaps other figures of similar importance?
Woman.
Pardon?
Oh. Oh. She's a woman.
Yeah, that's part. She's historically extremely important, as she is the first English woman to make her living as a writer, right? So she's the first professional woman writer in the English language that we know of, anyway. But part of the problem is that the details of her life, as we know them, are really pretty sketchy. We know very little about her, and because she seems to have been involved in some rather dodgy politics at various times, much about her background has been obscured. She also tends in her works to lie about herself and her own history. For example, in this particular thing that you read for in Oroonoko, what does she claim about her reason for being in Suriname? Why is she there in the first place? Who's she claimed to be related to? Yeah. Yeah, her father is supposed to have been the new governor, right? Yeah, not true. Not at all true. Her father, as far as we can tell, was a barber from Canterbury, right? Not a person who would be made governor of a major colony. So yeah, most biographies that you're going to see of Aphra, anything that tries to cover biographical details is going to be either really short or really speculative. Because again, we just don't know very much about her for sure. Now, this is actually a really cool resource. The International Slavery Museum in Liverpool hosts a website on the history of the slave trade, explains the concept of the trade triangle, how Africa was part of a network of trading within the Atlantic region. And there's even, if you go down to the bottom, you can get a sort of guided tour of the slave trade by clicking on one of these guides, right? So you will be guided by an enslaved person through what the experience of the Atlantic trade triangle was like. But yeah, you can see if you look through the website, pictures of various artifacts, some first-person accounts, both from enslaved peoples and from slave traders. It'll give you a pretty good idea of some of the history behind a text like Oroonoko. Also, this looks very, very old web, right? Very much, the internet from when I was in college, not when you are in college. And yeah, this is a pretty old site. It's lecture notes posted by a professor in the English department at University of California, Santa Barbara. But it's all still pretty useful stuff. So it doesn't look pretty, but there's useful information here. And finally, there's a short documentary. It's the beginning of a PBS series called Journey Through Slavery. And it talks about how the slave trade developed, particularly with particular attention to North America, because it's PBS, so the focus tends to be on American issues and American history rather than broader world history. But yeah, it's a really, really good, really powerful documentary. It uses excerpts from something we're going to be reading a little bit later in the course, the autobiography of Olaudah Equiano. And it also sort of discusses the way the development of slavery, at least in the North American colonies, was not inevitable. And there was a certain point at which it certainly could have not happened, had things gone in a slightly different direction. But even discussion of North American slave issues is relevant to what we're talking about today. There's a big focus in that documentary piece on the Carolina colonies. Now, does anybody know where the name Carolina comes from? Who the Carolina colony was named for?
King George's wife?
No, it's actually not named for a woman. It's named for a man. It comes from Carolus, which is the Latin form of what relatively common English name? Can anybody guess?
Carl? Not Carl.
Not Carl. Carl would actually be an alternate form of this same name. Think more French sounding.
Carlisle?
Nope, Charles. Carolus is the Latin form of Charles. So Carolina is Charles's land, Charles's country. So it's named for the English king, Charles II.
Close.
And Charles was a member of the House of Stuart, who had originally been the kings of Scotland. And the House of Stuart ruled England through most of the 17th century, right, when this particular text was written. So the first Stuart monarch of England was James I, Charles's grandfather, who ruled from 1603 to 1625. Charles's father, also Charles I, who ruled from 1625 to 1649. Does anybody know what happened to Charles? Assassinated probably isn't quite the right word.
Didn't. Oh,
Yeah, go ahead.
Or was executed?
Yeah, he was captured by the people, or by a certain faction of the people, and beheaded. There's an old Monty Python song. It begins, Charles I was 5 foot 8 inches tall at the beginning of his reign, and 4 foot 10 inches tall at the end of it. Right? Shorter by a head. And the leaders of the faction that deposed Charles I were Oliver Cromwell and later his son Richard. And the Cromwells rule England from 1649 to about 1660. And when people are tired of the Cromwells, right, the Cromwells only rule for a little over a decade. They invite back Charles's son in exile. And Charles II rules from 1660 to 1685. He's succeeded by his brother James. Charles having no legitimate offspring of his own. I say no, like he had plenty of offspring, just none with his wife. And James rules from 1685 to 1688, proves remarkably unpopular, in part due to a tyrannical streak in his personality, and in part due to the fact that he is trying to reintroduce Catholicism into England, or is suspected of doing so. And he's succeeded by his own daughter Mary, and by her Dutch Protestant husband William. And they rule jointly from 1688 to 1702.
What does that say?
What does what say?
The first name?
Mary.
Career name?
Yes, Mary the Second. Yes. So the period in which Charles II and James II rule is known historically as the Restoration, right? Because this is when the monarchy was brought back from exile, right? We tried another form of government for a little while. We tried this protectorate. We didn't care too much for the Cromwells, so we decided to bring back the royal family. Now, the Restoration is marked in a lot of ways by cultural excess. The piece of music, the reason I haven't erased this yet, that I was playing for you at the beginning of class, is by a guy named Henry Purcell. And Henry Purcell is the great English composer in what's called the Baroque style. And the piece of music, right, the particular style that this was in is called the chanson. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't actually speak French. A chanson. What this is a sort of series of decorative variations on a single bass line. Right? And in a lot of ways, that's what Baroque art is. It's a lot of decorative flourishes. It's taking something that's simple in its base and making it very, very fancy, very, very ornate. Now, this coincides with a huge increase, bless you, in sort of the general level of aristocratic wealth in England, right? The 1660s to the 1680s are a very, very good time to be a nobleman or a rich person in England. Now, does anybody have any idea why? How are people getting so rich?
The colony?
Yeah, exactly. Colonization of the New World, by and large. Right? So English people are going over to North America, to South America, to the Caribbean, and they're starting plantations there. And this trade, right, because they're English subjects, they're trading exclusively with England, right? They're trading things like, rice, indigo, tobacco, things that, luxuries by and large, that would otherwise be expensive or difficult to get. And these planters and their English sponsors are, as a result, becoming very, very, very rich. So people like Charles II can afford much, much fancier wigs than their predecessors could have. Right? This is a period of elaborate wigs. Does anybody know why they wore wigs?
Because they didn't bathe that often, so their
That's
hair
true.
would get all
Yeah.
gross and lice and...
Lice was actually the issue. Yeah, usually what people did was cropped their hair very, very short, and wore a wig. So almost anyone you see in a 17th or 18th century portrait, male or female, it's not their real hair. They're wearing a wig to avoid bugs. Now,
Wouldn't they just latch onto the wigs too, though? The lice?
yeah, but then you can take a wig off. You can't, we are not Lego people. We can't snap our hair on and off. Doesn't work quite that way. So you may still be getting infested with lice, you're just getting infested with fewer lice.
It's so gross. You don't have to sleep with the lice.
Yeah, well, it seems disgusting to us, right? But remember, like, for these people, it would have by and large just been a fact of life, right? I had a professor in graduate school who his specialty was the 18th century, and he said, like, look, like, before sanitation, before people in Europe started building underground sewers and things of that nature, it was like everything smelled abominable, right? Every place you went was basically an open sewer. And it didn't really bother anybody because they were used to it, right? They just couldn't conceive of any other way of being. It's like, yes, of course, the streets of London are full of piss and shit, right? They just are. People emptying their chamber pots out the window. You didn't have indoor plumbing, that was what you did.
Also the horses.
And the horses also, yes. In fact, it's still required by law in the United Kingdom that taxi drivers keep a shovel and bucket in their vehicle to clean up after their horse. It's not enforced, like they never actually repeal laws in England. They just stop enforcing them when they become impractical. So, to avoid getting too far into the realm of weird 18th century digression, right? It's not just trade with the colonies, like exclusive trade with the colonies, that's making these kings and their followers so rich. Charles and James are both patrons of a merchant consortium called the Royal African Company. So they sponsor trade missions to Africa and then get a cut of the profits. So trade across the Atlantic at this time worked primarily in a triangular fashion, right? So you've got Europe, in this case England, at the apex of the triangle, and they bring manufactured goods to trade in Africa, right, along what was called the Gold Coast. So sort of northwest Africa was where most of this activity was occurring. And then, yes?
I'm sorry, is that word grow?
Which word?
The one up.
Europe.
Europe. Oh.
Yes, Europe. So they take manufactured goods, anything from, furniture to, tableware to weapons, and they take them to Africa and sell them along the coast. They would trade these items for gold, ivory, and slaves. They would then take this to the Americas, where they drop off the gold, ivory, and slaves, which they would trade for raw materials, tobacco, and especially sugar. Right. Prior to the development of the Atlantic slave trade, very few people in Europe ever really ate sugar. The only means they had of growing sugar was beets, and sugar beets they don't produce as much as sugar cane, and it doesn't produce as good a sugar. It doesn't produce as fine a sugar. So yeah, go ahead, Alexis. Raw materials. Raw materials, yes. And so the Americas were better suited, particularly the region from the southern US to the Caribbean to northern South America, for sugar cane production. So Europeans were enjoying sugar and tobacco largely on the backs of enslaved people. Now, where were the European traders getting these slaves from? Were they actually getting off the boats, going into the interior, capturing themselves and dragging them to the ships? Now-
No, they were given by their own people, right?
Not necessarily
Leaders.
not necessarily by their own people. Typically what would happen is that chiefs or kings, right, would go to war with other tribes, and then they would enslave the prisoners, right, the prisoners that they took in war. And they would either keep those prisoners as slaves in their own society or sell them to European traders. Right? It became more and more common for these kings and princes to sell the slaves rather than keep them, as more and more ships kept coming from Europe. So they were enriching themselves as well. And you know, these prisoners of war had rather little to say about it. Now we can see in this particular text, well, is what we see here a simple attitude towards the slave trade, or does it seem to be kind of complicated? What seems to be Ben's attitude towards the institution of slavery in general?
She doesn't like it, but she never says she's against it throughout the whole story.
Yeah, does she seem to make differentiations between individuals who are enslaved and...
A little bit.
Yeah, who does she seem to privilege most throughout all of this? Yeah, Oroonoko / Caesar, as he is renamed. Is established from the beginning as not quite being not just a run-of-the-mill slave, but a run-of-the-mill person, right? He's not a run-of-the-mill member of his own society. He's not a run-of-the-mill, enslaved person in Suriname, right? He is different, marked as different from his first appearance by the author. If we look at page 204, right, the physical description that she gives us of Oroonoko. Right. This great and just character of Oroonoko gave me an extreme curiosity to see him, especially when I knew he spoke French and English and that I could talk with him. But though I had heard so much of him, I was as greatly surprised when I saw him as if I had heard nothing of him. So beyond all report I found him. He came into the room and addressed himself to me and some other women, with the best grace in the world. He was pretty tall, but of a shape the most exact that can be fancied. The most famous statuary could not form the figure of a man more admirably turned from head to foot. His face was not of that brown, rusty black which most of that nation are, but a perfect ebony or polished jet. His eyes were the most awful that could be seen, and very piercing, the white of him being like snow, as were his teeth. Now, one thing to note here is that the definition of awful in the 17th and 18th centuries is not our definition of awful. When we say something is awful, what do we usually mean?
Terrible.
That it's terrible, that it's wretched, it's no good, right? The original sense of the word focuses on these first two letters. The root of the word awful is awe. Yeah, someone who is awful is someone who, or something that is awful is something that inspires awe in you. His nose was rising and Roman, instead of African and flat, his mouth, the finest shape that could be seen, far from those great turned lips which are so natural to the rest of the Negroes. Bless you. The whole proportion and air of his face was so noble and exactly formed that, bating his color, there could be nothing in nature more beautiful, agreeable, and handsome. There was no one grace wanting that bears the standard of true beauty. His hair came down to his shoulders by the aids of art, which was by pulling it out with a quill and keeping it combed, of which he took particular care. So what does this description tell us about Oroonoko? How does Oroonoko look? How does she make him look?
Makes him seem very regal.
Okay, very regal, right? He's tall, he's handsome, very polished. He speaks French and English, right? So he's educated, at least educated in a European sense, right? What else is notable about this description, though? What is she at great pains to keep doing?
She's pointing out that he's dissimilar from, like, other Africans.
Yeah, his lips are different. He has a Roman nose. His coloring is different, right? His hair is straight.
He's biracial.
Well,
No,
he's not. Yeah,
The other ones.
yeah. She's not so much making him biracial. What she is doing, though, is she's making him look more European, right? He's got African coloring, but even that is, of a different standard, and he's got European facial features and a European hairstyle. So she's making her hero an African who looks in many ways like a European, but with darker skin. Now, what might be the point of that? Why is she at great pains to make Oroonoko look more like a European?
To make him more relatable or palatable for European people.
Yeah, I mean, she is writing for an English audience, right? So she probably wants a hero who they will be able to identify with in some sense, right? But it also plays into certain early assumptions that Europeans who were encountering Africans or Native Americans for more or less the first time tended to sort of make about them, right? So if we switch from this to the description she gives us of the native people of Suriname, right? She talks a lot about their clothes or lack thereof. And then on page 202, right, this adornment with their long black hair and the face painted in little specks or flowers here and there makes them a wonderful figure to behold. Some of the beauties, which indeed are finely shaped, are as almost all are, and who have pretty features, are very charming and novel, for they have all that is called beauty except the color, which is a reddish yellow. Or after a new oiling, which they often use to themselves, they are of the color of a new brick, but smooth, soft, and sleek. They are extreme modest and bashful, very shy, and nice of being touched. And though they are all thus naked, if one lives forever among them, there is not to be seen an indecent action or glance, and being continually used to seeing one another so unadorned, so like our first parents before the fall, it seems as if they had no wishes, there being nothing to heighten curiosity, but all you can see, you see at once, and every moment you see, and where there is no novelty, there can be no curiosity. So physically, how does she describe these people looking? Pardon? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the word.
Earthy.
Earthy? Okay, what makes you say earthy?
Naked. Flowers.
Okay, yeah. She spends a lot of time on the fact that they don't really wear clothes. Well, one, it's incredibly freaking hot in Suriname, right? Very, very humid. And two, like the fact that they don't wear clothes doesn't really seem to bother them, right? There doesn't seem to be anything sexualized for them about nudity, right? Much as, with people walking the stinking streets of London, right? It's just, they're used to it. They're accustomed to it. For them, it's normal state of being. What else about, specifically about their physical appearance? Anything that stands out?
they aren't very dark.
Yeah, she focuses quite a bit on their color, right? Their lack of perfection for her comes from the most obvious physical difference, which is their skin color. And so there's a tendency that we see in European literature and in European ethnography and even in European psychology up into the 20th century to treat non-white people essentially as defective white people. Right? White people with some kind of imperfection. Right? Oh, if only their skin were a lighter shade, then they'd be just like us. So that's part of what's going on here. This is part of the discourse that Ben is participating in. Right? That's one of the big issues at play here, right? Ultimately, right, Oroonoko and the Indians of Suriname cannot be like the colonists. Right? We're given sort of three different states of civilization which correspond to points on the trade triangle. Right, on the one hand, we have, right, in Africa, the kingdom of Coromantien, that Oroonoko comes from. And is Coromantien an uncivilized place, as it's described?
No.
Yeah, I mean, they have a stable society, right? Right, stable government. Right, consistent cultural practices. And they participate in trade, right? Right, the people of Coromantien trade with Europeans who come to them for that very purpose. Right? They trade in slaves, they trade in gold, they trade in, the various things that typically came from this point on the trade triangle. Now, what about the native people of Suriname? According to a European standard, would they be civilized?
No.
Yeah, they don't wear clothes. They don't seem to have any particular system of government, right? They sort of live at one with nature. And what is the state they're constantly compared to? What is our attention on, like, in their nakedness and relative innocence?
It's like she's painting a picture of innocence, of the pre-Edenic ideal.
Yep, exactly. Right, this is what our first ancestors were like before the fall, right? Suriname is a kind of innocent new Eden, where these sort of childlike peoples play at their innocent games. Although some of these games are not quite so innocent. We see what happens with the war chiefs, right? How is it that a war chief proves his bravery in this culture? What does he have to do? For the Indians in the text. What do they have to do to prove their bravery? Do they prove it by fighting other people? Let me see if I can find this particular passage. No, it's here somewhere. Right, they go to visit they go to visit one of the local tribes. If you look on page 234, around the middle of the page, Caesar had a mind to see and talk with their war captains, and we were conducted to one of their houses, where we beheld several of the great captains, who had been at council. But so frightful a vision it was to see him, no fancy can create. No such dreams can represent so dreadful a spectacle. For my part, I took them for hobgoblins or fiends rather than men. But however their shapes appeared, their souls were very humane and noble. But some wanted their noses, some their lips, some both noses and lips, some their ears, and others cut through each cheek with long slashes through which their teeth appeared. They had other several formidable wounds and scars, or rather dismemberings. They had comitius, or little aprons before them, and girdles of cotton, with their knives naked stuck in it, a bow at their backs, and a quiver of arrows on their thighs, and most had feathers on their heads of divers colors. They cried, Amore Tagame to us, at our entrance, and were pleased we said as much to them. They seated us, and gave us drink of the best sort, and wondered, as much as the others had done before, to see us. Caesar was marveling as much at their faces, wondering how they should all be so wounded in war. He was impatient to know how they came by those frightful marks of rage or malice, rather than wounds got in noble battle. They told us by our interpreter that when any war was waging, 2 men chosen out by some old captain, whose fighting was past, and who could only teach the theory of war, these 2 men were to stand in competition for the generalship, or great war captain. And being brought before the old judges, now past labor, they are asked, what they dare do to show us they are worthy to lead an army. When he, who was first asked, making no reply, cuts off his nose, and throws it contemptibly on the ground, and the other does something to himself that he thinks surpasses him, and perhaps deprives himself of lips and an eye. So they slash on, till one gives out, and many have died in this debate. And 'tis by a passive valor they show and prove their activity. So how do they prove that they're brave enough to lead an army?
They cut off pieces of their bodies.
Self-mutilation, yes. So why does Ben dwell on this particular practice when talking about people whom she otherwise describes as childlike, innocent, and largely harmless?
Because this makes them barbaric and not, I guess.
Yeah, this isn't something civilized people would do, for one thing, right? This is a barbaric and nasty practice. What makes it seem a shocking, nasty, and barbaric practice? I mean, apart from the simple fact of its violence. Let me put it to you this way. Why does it not seem a nasty, shocking, and barbaric practice to the people who do it?
Because that's their culture.
Yeah, because they're used to it. Yeah. To them, it's normal. And when Ben is when Aphra Behn is writing, right, there's no such thing yet as what we think of as a novel. Right? This is one of the first novels, arguably, in the English language. There were long prose narratives before this, but they tended to be stories about knightly adventure with all sorts of magic and warriors rescuing princesses, that sort of thing. It's rather a more formulaic sort. It takes place not so much in the everyday real world, but in a kind of world of enchantment, right?
So it's like the tales of King Arthur and his round table.
Yeah, things like some of those are in verse, some of those are in prose, right? But yeah, most prose narratives prior to the late 17th century take the form of romance. And there's usually some sort of allegorical meaning in a romance, right? Like everything in the narrative stands for something else outside of it, whether it's a spiritual concept or historical concept or what have you. So, what does the word novel actually mean as an adjective?
New.
Yeah. And so what a lot of early novelists try to do is present their readers with the shock of the new, right? With the shock of the unfamiliar. Now, a world of, castles and kings and knights and princesses would not have been terribly unfamiliar to the people who were consuming, medieval romances, right? By and large, aristocratic, educated people who were consuming these things at court. Descriptions of a new world, which would be a kind of new pastoral Eden, if not for the fact that people are always cutting bits off of themselves, right? That is something genuinely new. Now, these early novels tend not only to be kind of daring and shocking in content, but also are usually experimental in form. For one thing, they tend to rely on first-person narration, which the medieval prose narratives did not. Right? There's usually a sort of distant third-person narrator sort of telling you what happened in a medieval prose romance. In an early novel, you're almost invariably dealing with a first-person narrator relating things to you that they say happened to them. And these are usually things that happen in exotic and interesting places. Are any of you familiar with Robinson Crusoe? Okay, a couple of you are nodding, right? What happens to Robinson Crusoe?
He's stranded on an island.
Yeah, he's an Englishman who ends up stranded more or less by himself on an uncharted island, right? So part of the thrill of reading that narrative is that kind of thrill of exploration of an unknown place. Right? This is another part of the world that doesn't operate by the rules we're used to. And so yeah, many early novels, many prose narratives of the 17th and 18th centuries focus on explorations of exotic places, or places that would be exotic to the reader. So that's one of the reasons Ben dwells so much on difference when she's looking at, Coromantien, when she's looking at Suriname, right? She's describing a place that her readers have not seen. Now, she has also never seen Coromantien, right? All of that material, all the material about Africa, we can assume must be sort of secondhand, right? Because she doesn't meet Oroonoko until he is brought to Suriname. What about the Europeans, right? How does European civilization, as it's presented to us, compare to Coromantien or to Suriname? How do most of the Europeans in the text behave?
They always seem,
Go ahead.
they always seem sort of surprised by everything.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, this is a wondrous new Eden, right? Everything's surprising. Look at all these bizarre fish, right? Look at these cute little furry animals. Ouch, it bit my hand off. So everything is surprising to them because it's new. But what else do we notice about the European characters? How is it, for example, that Oroonoko ends up in Suriname in the first place?
He's true.
Yeah, he's tricked by an English captain who's befriended him, right? Right, the English captain knows, all right, Oroonoko is a pretty smart guy who is interested in mathematics and models and planning and things of that nature. Okay, so I'm going to lure him onto my ship. I'm going to promise to show him some stuff that he doesn't have and hasn't seen before. I'm going to lure him with the shock of the new onto my ship, get him drunk, lock him up and carry him across the ocean. And if we look on page 219, the third full paragraph Can I get a volunteer, actually, to read from This Commander Was a Man? Okay, Ash, go for it.
This commander was a man of a finer sort of address and conversation, better bred and more engaging than most of that sort of men are. So he seemed rather never to have been bred out of a court, than almost all of his life at sea. This captain, therefore, was always better received at court than most of the traders to those countries were, and especially by Oroonoko, who was more civilized, according to the European mode, than any other had been, and took more delight in the white nations, and above all, men of parts and wit. To this the captain he sold abundance of his slaves, and for the favor and esteem he had for him, made him many presents, and obliged him to stay at court as long as possibly he could, which the captain seemed to take as a very great honor done him, entertaining the prince every day with globes and maps and mathematical discourses and instruments, eating, drinking, hunting, and living with him so much familiarity that it was not to be doubted, but he gained very greatly upon the heart of this gallant young man.
Okay, thank you very much. We can stop there. Okay, so what is it that is so interesting to Oroonoko about this captain? What does this captain have? What's he like? Yeah, he's got the globes and maps and the new stuff, right? So we'll get to that in a minute. What about the way he comports himself?
He's well respected and trusted.
Yeah, Oroonoko trusts and respects him, but why does he trust and respect him? What about the captain himself makes Oroonoko trust and respect him? About his attitudes and behavior?
He's civilized and educated like himself.
Yeah, he acts like a gentleman, right? Like someone never bred out of a court. He's got manners. He's got culture. He's cultivated. Now, this is part of a broader discourse that runs through the novel. Right? If we go back to page 202, right, it's talking about the fact that the natives of Suriname have no notion of lying. "'Tis most evident and plain that simple nature is the most harmless, inoffensive, and virtuous mistress. 'Tis she alone, if she were permitted, that better instructs the world than all the inventions of man. Religion would here but destroy that tranquility they possess by ignorance, and laws would but teach them to no offense, of which now they have no notion. They once made mourning and fasting for the death of the English governor, who had given his hand to come on some such a day to them, and neither came nor sent, believing, when once a man's word was passed, nothing but death could or should prevent his keeping it. And when they saw he was not dead, they asked him what name they had for a man who promised a thing he did not do. The governor told them such a man was a liar, which was a word of infamy to a gentleman. Then one of them replied, 'Governor, you are a liar and guilty of that infamy.'" And we have lots of these instances, right, of cultivated, civilized people making promises to Oroonoko or to others that they have no intention of keeping. Right? So all of this cultivation, all of these fine manners, right, it's all a sort of thin veneer over dishonesty, right, over deceit. In fact, why is it that Oroonoko tells people that he cannot be a Christian or respect people of that faith? Because every one of them he's ever met is a liar, right? Every Christian he has ever met has tried to trick him or get one over on him or has promised him things that they then didn't deliver. So the elements of European civilization are by and large associated here with deceit, with dishonest, underhanded dealing. Whereas the people of Suriname and Coromantien are at least expected to keep their word. Although there is deceit and underhanded dealing in Coromantien as well, right? The grandfather, as absolute monarch, is able to dispose of people as he pleases. And that actually is another thing that marks Oroonoko as different from the rest of his people, right? How is he different in the way he gives his affections?
He's monogamous.
Yeah, he's the only monogamist in the elite level of his culture, right? Polygamy is what's normal. Oroonoko is abnormal because he devotes himself to one woman. Right? It can only be Melinda. No one else. Unlike his grandfather, who has, over 100 wives. So, to get back to the globes and maps, right? This is another thing that we see only in the hands of the European characters, right? What is a globe? What is a map? What are these things?
It represents the world.
Yeah, it's a representation. It's a model of a place, right? It's a model of space. A model, like a globe, usually a model of the whole world. A map, usually a model of some more specific, smaller place, right? But yeah, they're models of space. If you have globes, if you have maps, if you are capable of doing complex mathematical calculations, what does this allow you to do with space?
Manipulate it.
Yeah, you can manipulate it, right? You can move through it much more easily. It's much easier to get from place to place if you know where you're going. You can measure out distances. You can predict, okay, this is where we're going to make landfall, right? You don't have to simply look up at the sky and try to find that one star that's always in the same place so you know which way north is, right? This is when the Vikings, for example, got to North America, they got there by accident, largely. At least the first ones to sight the North American continent did. So what these models of space do, they allow you to control space. They're tools not just of trade, but also of colonization. Right? The fact that these guys are able to model space shows that they have some control over it. And the fact that Oroonoko has not seen globes or maps before, right? These are unfamiliar objects to him. Indicates that he is not in control of this space or any others. Right? His whole concept of space is different from that of those who've tricked him and taken him away. Now, one thing that we've talked about Oroonoko's difference from other Africans, right? Sort of in bits here and there. That he's represented as being different from the rest of his people. He's a monogamist. He doesn't look like everyone else. And who seems in the Parham plantation to take the fact of his slavery as a greater hardship than anyone else?
The trophy.
Okay, well, the guy who's most sympathetic to him at the plantation is this Treffery guy, who, he befriends him and promises, yes, I'll help you get home, and then never does, right? So more unfulfilled broken promises. But do we ever see Oroonoko doing anything that we'd call work?
No.
Yeah, he's not really made to work like the other slaves. Actually, we never really see any of the slaves doing work here, right? They're there, we're told that they do certain kinds of work, but we never actually see that activity. But yeah, Oroonoko isn't made to, he's sort of taken on as a kind of special companion by the people who run the plantation. Now, does this have an analog in Oroonoko's own experience? Has he ever done this himself? Does he himself have a privileged slave before he is captured? If you look on page 218. Right. He's defeated a prince of another tribe by the name of Jamoan, right? And we've already discussed, right, what's the common practice when someone is when someone's army is defeated, right? The captives are taken as slaves. Aristocrats were supposed to be able to ransom themselves. This Jamoan, the leader of the other army, afterwards became very dear to him, being a man very gallant and of excellent graces and fine parts, so that he never put him amongst the rank of captives as they used to do, without distinction, for the common sailor market, but kept him in his own court, where he retained nothing of the prisoner but the name, and returned no more into his own country, so great an affection he took for Oroonoko, and by 1,000 tales and adventures of love and gallantry, flattered his disease of melancholy and languishment. So what's Jamoan's function as slave to Oroonoko?
Entertain them.
Yeah. It's essentially, it's like, like having a buddy who is your buddy because you own him, right? He's not allowed to leave, right? He has to hang out with you because he's your property. This is basically the same status that Oroonoko is accorded at Parham House, right? At Parham Plantation. He is the sort of privileged slave who doesn't have to work and is a gallant companion to the people who own him. Now, having a privileged slave like this was actually considered a mark of high social distinction, right? If you had a slave or slaves who did not work, who you just kept around to entertain you, what did that indicate about your level of wealth and power?
You could afford to have a slave who didn't work.
Yeah. It indicates that you are so rich, you are so powerful, that you don't need to put all of your slaves to work.
So does he belong to the captain then, since he spends the most time with them? Is that what that meant?
Does who belong to the captain? Well, Oroonoko belongs to the absentee landlord
Okay.
at Parham House. Right? This Lord Willoughby, who is at sea and never shows up, right?
I had trouble understanding.
But yeah, he spends all of his time hanging out with the narrator and the Cornish overseer of the plantation, this Treffery, and these other people who don't put him to work. And yet he's the one who leads the slave revolt, right? The one who is sort of least affected by the material conditions of slavery is the one who is most willing to try to throw it over. Why is that? Why do you think that is?
His spirit hasn't been broken. I mean, he has his
Mhm.
wife.
Yeah. And what state is she in?
Break.
Yeah. And if their child is born while they are still enslaved, what does that mean?
The child is a slave.
That the child is also property of Parham Plantation. So on the one hand, he's motivated by fears for the fate of his unborn child, right? If my wife and I are still slaves when our child is born, that child will also be a slave. And it might also be useful to think about as well. There's a French anthropologist. His name is Claude, and how the hell do I spell that? Meillassus, Claude Meillassus. And he makes a distinction between what he calls the condition of slavery and the state of slavery. When he talks about the condition of slavery, what he's referring to is the material conditions of slavery, right? Whether slaves are well fed and well housed, right? Whether they're well treated or whether, whipped, that sort of thing, right? The basic physical existence of slavery, right? Whether you are well treated or poorly treated. So what do you think he means by state of slavery? If the condition refers to solely the material conditions of slavery, your physical well-being and how well that's kept up, what then is the state of slavery? Yeah. Mental, social, emotional, right? Yeah, your sense of identity as a slave. Right? As a person who is someone else's property, as a person who thus socially does not matter. So, changes in the condition of slavery, right? Whether you're well treated or poorly treated, do not change the state of slavery, right? Your sense of yourself as someone else's property. So what Oroonoko objects to is which? The condition or the state?
The state.
Yeah, he's kept in better conditions really than anyone else. What he objects to is having to identify as a slave. If we look at his speech to rile up his fellows on page 236. Caesar, having singled out these men from the women and children, made an harangue to them of the miseries and ignominies of slavery, counting up all their toils and sufferings under such loads, burdens, and drudgeries as were fitter for beasts than men, senseless brutes than humane souls. He told them it was not for days, months, or years, but for eternity there was no end to be of their misfortunes. They suffered not like men who might find glory and fortitude in oppression, but like dogs that loved the whip and bell, and fawned the more they were beaten. That they had lost the divine quality of men, and were becoming insensible asses, fit only to bear. Nay, worse, an ass, or dog or horse having done his duty, could lie down and retreat, and rise to work again, and while he did his duty endured no stripes. But men, villainous, senseless men such as they, toiled on all the tedious week till Black Friday, and then, whether they worked or not, whether they were faulty or meriting, they promiscuously, the innocent with the guilty, suffered the infamous whip, the sordid stripes, from their fellow slaves till their blood trickled from all parts of their body. Blood whose every drop ought to be revenged with the life of some of those tyrants that impose it. So, is he talking here about the state or the condition of slavery? When he's talking about the whip and the work and the burden.
Condition.
Yeah, he's talking about the condition here. That's what he's using to incite the other slaves to revolt, right? But he has not shared in this condition. In fact, what do the other slaves recognize him as when he first appears at Parum? How did they end up in Suriname?
He sold them?
Yeah. Oroonoko was the guy who sold them. He was the prince who captured them in battle and sold them to people like the English trader who tricked him. So he's focusing here on conditions that he never experiences until after the revolt. He hasn't been treated like the others. And why, said he, my dear friends and fellow sufferers, should we be slaves to an unknown people? Have they vanquished us nobly in fight? Have they won us in honorable battle? And are we by the chance of war become their slaves? This would not anger a noble heart. This would not animate a soldier's soul. No, but we are bought and sold like apes or monkeys to be the sport of women, fools, and cowards, and the support of rogues, renegades that have abandoned their own countries for rapine, murder, thefts, and villainies. Do you not hear every day how they upbraid each other with infamy of life below the wildest savages? And should we render obedience to such a degenerate race who have no one human virtue left to distinguish them from the vilest creatures? Will you, I say, suffer the lash from such hands? So, the important and subtle thing that Oroonoko says in this particular speech, does Oroonoko say himself that slavery should not be, that slavery should not exist?
No, he says that it should not be a thing if it ever went in battle or.
Yeah, the kind of traffic in slaves that he practiced, right, winning captives in honorable battle, as he puts it, that's all right. Tricking people into a lifetime of servitude, that's not. Right? The emphasis he seems to place here is on deception. What is it that makes these other people bad? They are deceitful. And they are. At least, the white characters he deals with throughout the narrative are deceitful, by and large. These are not honest people. People who make a fair show to him and then never follow through on their bargains. And indeed, they bring him back from the brink of death only to execute him, right? And this is just one, where I'd actually like to end is at the very end of the novella, appropriately. We've already noticed some tendency towards parallelism in the narrative. Right? We have those parallel physical descriptions of the people of Suriname and of Oroonoko. We have the parallel of Oroonoko himself keeping a privileged slave and then becoming one in the New World and struggling against that state. And we have a final parallel on page 246. When Oroonoko dies, how is it that he's killed?
They cut off his nose and maimed him.
Mm-hmm. They start cutting bits off of him, right? He had learned to take tobacco, and when he was assured he should die, he desired they would give him a pipe in his mouth, ready lighted, which they did. And the executioner came and first cut off his members and threw them into the fire. After that, with an ill-favored knife, they cut his ears and his nose and burned him. He still smoked on, as if nothing had touched him. Then they hacked off one of his arms, and he still bore up and held his pipe. But at the cutting off of the other arm, his head sunk, and his pipe dropped, and he gave up the ghost without a groan or a reproach. So what is Oroonoko demonstrating here as his captors cut him to pieces?
Kind of a mental fortitude.
And where did he learn this? Where else have we seen this?
From the war chiefs.
Yeah, this is how the war chiefs prove their bravery, right? Not by engaging in battle, but by contemptuously cutting off parts of themselves until one of them gets scared and gives up. And the guy who didn't get scared and give up becomes the general. So what he once condemned as passive valor right? Does he have any more avenue at this point for active valor? What has revolt, what has battle earned him? Is that still something he can do? Is that still an arena in which he can prove himself? Yeah, not gonna, he's been defeated. He can't trust the other slaves to follow through with him. So active valor, valor in battle, that's done. The only way he can continue to prove himself and get one over on his captors, on these people who've cheated and deceived him, is through passive valor, right? Through bearing up stoically while they cut him apart. And he's even taking tobacco as he does it, like actually consuming one of these common colonial products. Okay, so that's all we have time for. I get the sense that many of you were a little bit confused by this. The 18th century language is a little difficult. So we're sticking with 18th century texts for next time. We're going to be looking at Voltaire's Candide. And if you just hold up a moment, I have a couple of reading questions for you.